Welcome back, baseball fans. 1972-75 carryover league draft. We have the draft results were done for the 8 rounds of the draft, and then we go into the token round where we have to complete getting 20-man rosters together. And the reason for that is that during the draft, teams will often improve a player instead of drafting a player. And this practice idea, I started a long ago, and I seem to recall that it was usually reserved for getting a guy into a Hall of Fame year, or just a Hall of Fame player moving into his prime years, and all stars, like top of the game kind of players. It was like an exception. And so originally it was like 6 guys, and then 6 to 12 guys, and then some years 16, and last past year, I think a year ago, it got up to like 20 because all teams were starting to use this practice just to make their teams better. Period. Make their teams better. Well, in this particular year, we have a new record for number of improvements that were done during the draft, and that is these guys here, 30 of them. So teams decided basically that instead of picking maybe perhaps marginal talent in the draft, we can sign those guys as undrafted guys. Let's just make the players that we have on our roster a lot better. So what it does is it creates a kind of a 3-tier roster where you've got a top layer of star players and then a bottom layer of guys that are like 1-year band-aids that are not necessarily desirable, that you're going to have to take in this undrafted free agent. Meaning that the middle portion and the most populous portion of your roster is slightly vacated there. And we'll see, like with some teams, the notorious team for this is the Dodgers, where they sort of started this a couple years ago when they had a very good Don Sutton and Jim Brewer card, but then they said, you know what, let's make them ridiculously good in 1972. And so they did that, and by doing that, they had to bring up Steve Garvey and Joe Ferguson with their 71 cards, which were mostly AAA players. So you have superstars Sutton and Brewer, and struggling AAA players Garvey and Ferguson on the same team. And the Dodgers are the one that have kept doing it, and in this particular draft, Atlanta did it a few times, Kansas City did it a few times, the Twins did it a few times, as did the Mets, and Oakland, and San Diego, Seattle, St. Louis. So a lot of teams are doing it to emulate what a tradition the Dodgers started, while other teams aren't doing it at all. It's going to make for, or it did make for, a very curious token round of the draft, in which not only do you have to find the 30 guys to replace the vacated draft spot, you also want to swap out cards on your own team that just don't fit anymore. You know, like you got too many second basemen, you don't have enough outfielders, you got too many lefties, too many righties, you get the idea. So that all has to happen here in what I call the undrafted free agent token part of the draft. And I have to go to the token list again to show you that the tokens are simply, each team starts the offseason with 5, and then every time a transaction is done, a trade or something to balance out a trade is done, it'll go +1 or -1 to a team, potentially +2 or -2 if it's an exceptional trade. And then you have accumulation here. So again, 32 teams means you start with 160, you finish with 160, but instead of everybody having 5, the numbers are all, kicked all around. Every team's getting pluses and minuses. So with that, when we put our token list together, we start with the team that has the most tokens, and if there's no tie, then they're the first pick in that particular token round of the draft, and then the tiebreaker is draft order. So by tiebreaker, what we mean is Ohio, for instance, is the first number 1 first round pick, So they would get the first crack in the sixes, and then for every token round, the sixth, the fifth, the fourth, the third, the second, and first, Ohio would get the first pick within that particular round. However, six isn't really good enough for Ohio in this particular case, as they have, this is the overall quantity number in the token round. They ended up with a seventh overall pick in the token round because the Expos had 4 of the first 6 choices, because they had 10 tokens, a staggering amount of tokens, because they made all sorts of deals in the off season, getting Dave McNally, they traded Mike Marshall, they traded Rusty Staub. They made a lot of deals, and this 2 was, I forget what annual team that was. But they had 10 overall tokens, so this is like cash in your, busting out of your pant pocket, busting out of your wallet there. And so you like to spend it if you can, because you don't get to respend it next year. You don't stack these tokens into a following year. So they had the luxury of finding, if they really wanted, the 4 best players on the street. And they could have had all 4. And there's 2 situations here. The one situation is the Expos have a very good roster now, number 1. Number 2, they only had 1 spot to fill, and they were looking for fit versus statistics. So the only spot they needed was a shortstop versus right-handed pitching with some power, because they were happy with Ted Martinez versus left-handed pitching at shortstop and his defense. So they found the right match, which is Billy Grabarkowitz, a guy with a lot of power and on base and can play short against right-handed pitching versus any of the other available players in 72. And so they took him with token number 10. And then after re-examining their roster immediately, because they're on the clock again, the Expos looked high and low on the roster of ways to make it better and said, you can't make this any better. I'll just kind of read off the names of some guys. Ron Fairley, J.L. Liu, Gary Carter, Mike Jorgensen, Ron Hunt, Bob Bailey. They aforementioned Grabarkowitz and Ted Martinez. They had Jim Nettles. They really liked this guy. John Bacabella, Expo catcher. Jerry White, Leroy Stanton, Steve Rogers, Bill Stoneman, McNally, Ranko, Walker, Bob Reynolds from Baltimore with a 186 ERA, Mickey Scott, and of course Dale Murray, their closer, with a 103 ERA. So the Expos said, let's go. Roll the ball out. We're ready to go. So they pass on the 9th token. They pass on the 8th token. After a few picks, they pass on the 7th token. Now this is kind of an indictment on the talent that you're probably going to see in the token round of the draft that 30 player-hungry teams are going to have to deal with. So it's going to be actually a long draft, so I'm not going to take too much time with this. So California needed a relief pitcher. They took Gary Ross, who has a 2.45 ERA in 90 innings. Nice pick. San Diego, by the way, next up, Gary Ross was a Padre, and the Angels snookered him off. So there's a situation. That's the sort of the draft. Just like any fantasy draft you played in, the guy picking ahead of you stole your player. So that's what they did. That's okay. Padres. The Padres needed a right-handed reliever who gets lefties out. And Ed Farmer, also a 22-year-old guy, does exactly that in a split. So his ERA is 4.40 in 61 innings, but the split's very advantageous. He does get lefties out. So San Diego, it worked out for them anyway. Now we finally get to Ohio, the 7th choice, the first team to pick. They needed help at third base versus left-handed pitching, and they were just looking for a split guy again. So when I say split guy, I mean like we talked about Grabarkowitz. He's got a 167 batting average, but it's probably 250 versus righties. Jackie Hernandez, same thing, a 188 hitter. He's probably around 250 versus lefties. So they get Jackie Hernandez at third base to platoon with Jerry Kenney on Ohio. The Rangers, next. They needed a left-handed number 5 starter, and how about David Clyde, 18 years old, out of high school. He only has to be your number 5 starter, can pitch out of the bullpen. He debuts with a 5.01 ERA in 93 innings. So that's the story of David Clyde. He does arrive in Texas. Next up, we have Arizona. needing a middle infielder. They get Fred Stanley. He can play all middle infield positions. The Twins, the Angels. This actually, with the Angels, was a situation where they wanted better catcher than the catcher they had. They had Glenn Borgman. They didn't like him for some reason. They wanted a left-handed catcher. Kurt Blefary was a guy, as a left-handed batter, you could stick him all over the place. So he's a left-handed catcher with power that the Angels selected there. Notice that the Angels started with 7 tokens. They got Gary Ross. With their 6th token, they got Kurt Blefary. So they've already added 2 players in this part of the draft. And then the Padres again. You see Expos, Angels, Padres. Expos, Angels, Padres. Padres needed a catcher to replace Chris Cannizzaro, and they got Mike Ryan, a catcher with a -1 arm. Cleveland's up next. They needed a lefty reliever. They got Joe Grisenda. Interestingly, he's a lefty who's not that bad against righties. He's terrible against lefties at age 35, which is why he was put on waiver by Toronto. We see the Expos passing, and then we get a new team, the White Sox, with 6 tokens. And the White Sox said, we had a perfect draft. We'll see you. Roll the ball out. We're ready to go. So the White Sox passed. They're done. They went home. They're out fishing right now, and they're doing cartwheels. They love their draft. So next up, Tigers. Tigers do a 2-parter here. Tigers can do something in the token round of the draft where you have 2 players in your team, but they're in the wrong years. The 2 players were Joe Coleman and Bill Freehan. Coleman was in 74. Freehan was in 72. They decided to flip their years, making both players much better. So as a 2-part token move, they moved Joe Coleman from his 74 card to a 72 card, and then we're going to scroll down a little bit till we get to Detroit again. And Bill Freehan goes from the 72 card into a 74 card for Freehan, where he hits 297. Joe Coleman's 72 card, he's got a 280 earned run average. So both cards get much better for the Tigers. The Pirates added, they made some improvements in the draft. So they needed to get a right-handed reliever, and they got Randy Moffett with a 2.42 ERA in 100 innings. I guess you could say the corresponding move there, if you want to go back to this list, is that Pittsburgh improved Jim Rooker. So that meant they had a vacant pitching spot, so they needed to add a pitcher, and that's the pitcher they found. Rooker, Keeson moves out of the rotation, joining Moffett in the bullpen. They later get John Candelaria. All right, so now we've already did tokens 10, 9, and 8. Thank you, Expos. The 7s, the 6s, and now we're going to move into the 5s. So starting with Ohio. So this is really where all teams should be. Right around the midpoint is 5 tokens. But a lot of teams who need players are teams that made a lot of deals already and lost tokens. But that's all right, because you've got to get to a 20-man roster, even if everybody's left the conference center, and you're sitting there all by yourself trying to find guys off the street to sign. So Ohio players, how about that? They passed. They're happy. Literally, they added Jackie Hernandez, and they said, okay, we drafted first anyway. We should be good, and we're an expansion team, so we're good. Florida Marlins at 2 also passed. Now we get to hear from the Kansas City Royals for the first time. They needed to get a corner outfielder who bats left-handed. They needed to add 2 needs. They improved George Brett and Larry Gura. So one of the 2 needs that they vacated, they had an 18-man roster. They needed a left-handed bat to platoon with Al Cowens, and they found Jim Dwyer. Jim Dwyer, solid outfielder, left-handed bat, at 279, 720 OPS. So he'll platoon with Al Cowens. They'll have Amos Otis in center, and they'll have Lou Piniella in left. Texas Rangers, getting David Clyde was all they needed. So they had now passed. A new team, the Colorado Rockies. What did they have up here? Oh, they improved Rick Monday. So they needed just 1 player, and they needed to add a corner outfielder to platoon with Andy Costco. And they found another one. Very interesting here, that Kansas City and Colorado had the same needs. Fortunately, they both found guys, and they happened to be in different years, so they weren't really competing with each other. And by what I'm saying in different years is we, of course, know that every team has to comport to the proper number of players in 72, 73, 74, 75. You start with 8, 6, 4, 2. So that's why it has to be a specific year when you're adding a player. So Jim Lytle was the Colorado player added. Corner outfielder with good defense. Hit .259, but it's very good against righties. Not very good against lefties. And so that brings the overall batting average down. Arizona now passes. Fred Stanley is all they needed. And our friends California passed finally after making 2 moves. So you have to feel good that you actually got 2 players. And basically, the talent pool is not that particularly good anyway, and you can go home. And you still have a lot of teams out there. Look, you know, I'm paging down. You still have a lot of teams need to add talent at this point. All right, the New York Mets, they needed to do a couple things here. Again, the star teams, you know, they do this stuff. You know, they improve Wayne Garrett, they improve Lee Lacy, and it's like, really? Do you really want to do that? I know they're better, but stick with the card they have, and then you could draft better guys and not have to go with the undrafted free agent route. But the Mets had a hole in outfield, and they actually got one of their own guys, Don Hahn. Don Hahn was a New York Met in the year of '73, so it made sense. And I kind of do that when I see these guys on the street. That's why they're sitting there, is that other teams didn't want him, and he was waiting for the Mets to come calling. The Mets almost drafted Don Hahn earlier, and they skipped on it, and now they get him here, undrafted free agent. So that's kind of like an NFL story when they're talking to a kid and they say, hey, if such and such doesn't take you, we're going to draft you. Then the kid doesn't hear about it, and then the draft's over and he's getting discouraged. Then he gets the phone call when all the players get phone calls in undrafted free agency. So Don Hahn got his card. He basically got his call. He basically got it because he's a 2 in center field. So the Mets realized we have this incredible pitching staff. Make sure we have defense everywhere. And Willie Mays is gone. Don Hahn can't replace Willie Mays, but at least defensively he's a 2 in center, so he can match the range that Willie Mays brought there. Our friends the Padres have passed after making 2 selections. Thank you, San Diego. All right, a new team, Houston. Let's see. They actually, I don't think needed to make a move. No, they didn't have to make a move, but they elected to add a corner outfielder, Roger Freed, and let go of Joe Haig, who was an extra first baseman they didn't need. So Roger Freed can platoon in right field with Wilbur Howard as a right-handed bat versus left-handed pitching. He, of course, has a magnificent 1977, but they can't really stretch those together, unfortunately. They're going to miss by a year. 72, 73, 74, 75. So this Freed card will expire, and the 77 Freed card won't exist next year. So he at least can platoon against lefties. All right, Cleveland Indians. They saw what the Detroit Tigers did, and they did a similar thing with 2 of their players, Jack Brohammer and Buddy Bell. And this is pretty cool, because Jack Brohammer was a 4 second baseman, and Buddy Bell was a 3 second baseman in the years of 72 and 73. They flipped their years. So now Jack Brohammer moves back into a 72 card, where he's a 2E20. We'll scroll down here to Cleveland, and Buddy Bell moves into a 73 card, where he's a 2E23, joining Frank Duffy, who became a 2 at shortstop. So Cleveland's doing some clever stuff with their defense, all 2s in the infield. So that's pretty darn good for the Indians. Next up, the Cardinals. This is, I think, the first time we heard from them. Hey, we got Don Buford basically to 35-year-old outfielder, same age as Lou Brock, but Buford can play defensively in left field where Brock cannot, so he can come in late in games to play defense for Lou Brock, and hits left-handed pitching fairly well if you have a really tough lefty and you want to give Brock the day off. You see the Expos. You see also here, they would have picked 20th overall. So they're passing again. And again, every time you see the Expos, it'll be a pass. Till eventually, once you get the 6 tokens, the team vanishes from the list altogether. They don't, you know, they're not. The formula each round of the draft subtracts 1 for the token list, and once it does it 6 times, the team will just disappear and not be there anymore. So next up is the Cubs. And the Cubs, like the White Sox, the Chicago team loved their draft. Neither of the Chicago teams here, did any improvement to their rosters. They were satisfied with what they had, and they knocked it out of the park with what they drafted. So the Windy City is happy with their 2 teams. The Cubs passed. All right, the Yankees needed to make some moves. Roy White's the left fielder, but his defense got really bad suddenly. Plus, he always had a bad throwing arm, so they needed an outfielder versus left-handed pitching, and they found Ron Swoboda China. I'm going to get you on a Swoboda China. Lucy Ball sang that in her show there with Desi Arnaz. And anyway, Swoboda will play corner outfield at age 28, returns to New York, former New York Met, with the Yankees this time, and will play corner outfield for the Yankees. Okay, the White Sox will see the pass again. You'll always see pass if they pass the first time. The Tigers, now we're down to the freehand portion of that 2-part deal. And the Pirates have passed. So now we're getting down to 4 tokens. And hopefully we'll start seeing more passes by familiar teams, such as Ohio and Florida. Kansas City still needed to make a move. Remember, they needed to make 2 moves because it was improvements for Brett and Gura. So they needed to get an outfielder and a pitcher. They got the outfielder, which was Jim Dwyer. Now they got the pitcher. So Bill Gogolewski, former Texas Ranger, will take up Larry Gura's bullpen spot, as Gura will now be a starting pitcher. Gogolewski in the bullpen, nothing special, 4.22 ERA, but he's got a good split, 123 innings, all out of the bullpen. So he was used a lot by the Rangers. The Rangers, funny thing, would have drafted next, but they weren't interested in him. They've already passed anyway. Boston, is this the first time we've heard from them? I believe so. All right, so Boston had to add a catcher because Fisk was the only catcher on the roster. Every team has to have 2 catchers. So normally what I do is I make the second catcher your designated hitter versus left-handed pitching usually. And that's the case here of Dwayne Josephson, who was a Red Sox. And actually, Dwayne hits .268, and it's advantageous versus left-handed pitching. So it's a win-win for the Red Sox. I don't think we've heard from the Cincinnati Reds yet, but they've passed because they're the big red machine and mashed the draft out of the park. I can look up here to confirm they didn't improve any players alphabetically here. You don't see the CIN, the Chicago initials either. So Cincinnati passed. All right, our first mention of Seattle. They've got some work to do. They're a team that has a lot of platoon players, and they got to see if they can find some everyday fits if possible. And they found a guy in 73 who actually fits on a short sample size. Actually, it's not that short a sample. What am I talking about? It's 352 plate appearances. Al Gallagher's 27 years old, can play all infield positions, 352 plate appearances. The guy hits .273, 345 on base. He's got no power, but he walks and gets hits, and he can play all over the infield. So he'll be a very useful player. And frankly, in this process, to get, you've seen some really sketchy names here, folks. To get, a decent .273 hitter who can play every day this late in the undrafted free agency is a good sign for Seattle. Colorado passes. They took a guy earlier. They took Jim Lytle. And Arizona passed again. The Angels have passed. All right, the Mets needed to make 2 moves. Don Hahn was the good move. But I like this move even better. Tony Salata, who's got a really nice period here where he's very productive from 73, 74, 75, would do it with Kansas City and California. He keeps getting blocked by their first baseman. In Kansas City, he was blocked by John Mayberry. In California, I think they had Jim Spencer. So the Mets said, we needed a defensive upgrade on John Milner, who was a 4 at first base. So Salata will play first now for the Mets, and John Milner will go to designated hitter where he should be, where they wouldn't normally have had a designated hitter in the National League during that time. What does Salata bring? He gives you power, On base, a left-handed batter who can hit left-handed pitching okay. And if you hold on to Saleta, you can improve him and make him, in 75, he's got a 900 OPS and is a 2. So that would be a heck of a thing for the Mets to do next year when they have some space to add a 75 player. They couldn't do it this year because they improved Wayne Garrett and Lee Lacy. But Saleta's numbers, 268, 361 on base, and a 767 OPS. And again, trying to make the Met defense better. So we had Hahn as a 2 in center, and we had Saleta as a 3 at first, replacing a 4. All right, the Milwaukee Brewers. Is this the first time we've heard from these guys? It might very well be. And they had to find a infielder. The guy can play second, perhaps bat left-handed or switch hit. And they get to have Paul Popovich this year. Paul Popovich is in the league every year, it seems, on a different team because he's a switch-hitting middle infielder who can play second, third, and short, and he's a 3 everywhere. So if he's got an advantageous split on one side, you use it over there. And these got utility players always get in the league. Normally, a utility player will get into the league versus a lot of clunky first base or corner outfield types who only have a one-way platoon, mostly because those types are very populous. Popovich has a very specific task, and guys like him are very valuable. Padres pass, and I think Houston now passes after getting Roger Freed. The Twins, this is the first time we've heard from them, and they've got work to do they not? Yeah, they got fancy by improving Phil Roof and Larry Heisel. And, let's not scoff at what they did. I mean, they got Roof and Heisel into 837, 870 OPS cards. So don't bang on the fact that here they are looking for more players. And frankly, they did pretty well for themselves. They needed a corner outfielder versus left-handed pitching, and they found this guy, Ron Woods, who's a 2, E2-3 in right field. And it's an advantageous split versus left-handed pitching. He's a 258, 321, 746, but it's better against lefties and righties, and that's what the Twins needed. All right, then you see Cleveland's Buddy Bell move, the second part of that 2-part move. Then the Cardinals needed to make a second move. They did Don Buford up there. The Cardinals, by the way, it was because they improved Ted Simmons and Al Hrabowski at age 25 into their best years. Simmons a 332 hitter, Al Hrabowski a 166 ERA. Just like the Twins, we just spent. Let's not complain about the Cardinals needing players when you're adding talent that good. And the good news about the Cardinals is they actually had positions available with coverage. So they just needed a dude. They just needed a guy. And what better time to add a guy without a position than now? And it's Jim Hart. Jim Hart was a National Leaguer, played for the Giants. But in 73, he goes to the Yankees and is a designated hitter. He's a guy that platoons with Ron Blomberg, a designated hitter. It's Blomberg and Jim Ray Hart. So now he'll go to the Cardinals, since we have a DH in the National League, and be their designated hitter. 254, 419 slugging, 742 OPS for Jim Hart, age 31. All right, we haven't heard from Portland, and they decide to pass. The Cubs, we know they passed earlier. The Yankees, they drafted, this is a pretty clever move that the Yankees made. They drafted Luke Walker in a different year just to get his rights, knowing that once they got to undrafted free agency, they would replace him with a different year. And the year they replaced him with is 72. So now Luke Walker, who had a 4.69 ERA, has been replaced with his 72 card, where he's still got a 3.40 ERA in 92 innings, a lefty out of the bullpen, and really probably his final year in baseball. He's got a couple more years, but the stats aren't very good. All right, next up, the Blue Jays. And check this out. The Blue Jays actually still had the rights to Tommy A.G. and never pulled the trigger because they were hemming and hawing between 72 and 73. And they waited to this moment and decided to take the 73 version of Tommy A.G. as he's only a 222 hitter in both years, but in 73, his defense is better and he hits right-handed pitching with a lot more power. And his buddy Cleon Jones is with him, Tommy Agee, Cleon Jones, Ed Kranepool are all here in Toronto. Clendenon retired, unfortunately, that he can't join them anymore. So Toronto is, went to the playoffs as a surprise wild card last year by trying to steal the Mets formula of '69, and we'll see if they can pull it off again. So they're the Miracle Blue Jays, you can call them. All right, we haven't heard from the Giants yet, and they phoned this in that they passed. They left the building a long time ago. Their draft absolutely knocked it out of the park. So they left. They actually went fishing with the White Sox. Both those teams are gone. And finally, we start hearing from some teams that need to make moves, and we haven't heard from them yet. Beginning with Oakland. We are 58 choices in. A lot of passing, of course, but Oakland has had to wait 58 picks before they address the needs on their roster. Oakland, they improved Dave Hamilton and Claudell Washington, so they have to make 2 moves here. So here, Oakland takes they need to get a designated hitter. Claudell Washington will play center field, but he can have Rusty Torres play for him defensively. So the new DH, because they traded Orlando Cepeda in the offseason, will be Steve Olivares, and he becomes a very cool Oakland kind of player because Oakland covets on-base percentage. And Olivares, in his career that lasts from all the way through like 1979, I think he's with the Cubs and the Giants, he draws walks everywhere he goes. And he's a switch hitter, and he can play first, third in the outfield. 265 with a gaudy 375 on base. And you know how the Oakland A's love their own base percentage. So Steve Olivares is the next pick for the A's. Atlanta on the clock. Atlanta, they had to make 2 moves. Oh, but again, Atlanta, they made Ralph Garr a 353 hitter, and they gave Phil Niekro a 238 ERA and 20-game winner, and arguably his best statistical year. So they're going to have to make a couple moves, the first of which for Atlanta is they had a hole defensively at first base and versus left-handed pitching because they have Frank Tepedino who can only hit righties. They found Mike Andrews, who's actually, curiously, a second baseman as a 4, but as a first baseman he's a 2. And he has plenty of on base as well for the White Sox. And so Mike Andrews will be in a platoon for Atlanta. Nothing splashy there. They just had to fill a roster spot. A jag, just a guy, as we like to say. All right, the Phillies have woken up to the reality that we still need a left-handed pitcher. Oh, no. Yep, they still need a left-handed pitcher. Everybody else has gone through this conundrum at this point. Not the Phillies. They have to finally look at the elephant in the room. They didn't select Dan McGinn with a 5.96 ERA. They didn't select John Cumberland with a 7.65 ERA. They did select Mark Schaefer. And if you watch the Winter Baseball Classic, Mark Schaefer played in that just to see how this card would play. And he did rather well. He actually pitched about a dozen innings, had an ERA right around 3.54. He's 24 years old. His card has a 4.61 ERA, but when you look deeper into the card, you find that the whip is a staggering 195. Now, the good part about trying to rationalize the Phillies conundrum is that it's a lot of walks, but it's not a lot of homers, not a lot of extra base hits. So it's just a ton of walks this poor kid gives up. He's the new wildest thing. We've had many wild things in our league, but Mark Schaefer will clearly be the wild thing. And he just becomes the long guy in Philly just to eat up innings. Philly, you would think, would be in a lot of high-scoring games with an explosive offense. And sorry, that's the unfortunate role you get when you don't address left-handed pitching earlier in the draft. You don't want to be that team. And they are. All right, the Orioles, Baltimore. Do they have to make any moves? They didn't have to make a move, but it's the first time we've heard from them, and they did. They needed a catcher. They got rid of Chopay, who was an extra outfielder. They needed a second catcher to go with newly acquired Earl Williams. And they got Chris Cannizzaro. Nice card for him with on base. 240 hitter, but a 341 on base. So a nice addition to behind the plate. And he's a zero arm. And frankly, Elrod Hendricks and Andy Etchebarren were their catchers. They have Earl Williams with his 28 home runs and Chris Cannizzaro. And Canizzaro's got a zero arm. So not bad for Baltimore, finding that value. All right, the Tigers, they needed to, they found that Mickey Stanley's 75 card was not particularly good that they drafted. So what they decided to do was swap him out to his 72 card and go to LeManchek's 75 card. So they had the rights to Mickey Stanley, so they were able to do that. So LeManchek comes on in 75. It's not a spectacular move. He's got a 4.46 ERA, but he's a relief 4 starter 8, and eventually he might be the number 4 starter next year for the Tigers. And of course, the second part of that move is down here, when Mickey Stanley is moved back into a 72 card. The other reason Detroit did that is Ron LaFleur was added to the roster after Mickey Stanley was added to the roster. LaFleur can hit righties. Mickey Stanley can still hit lefties. So this kind of is a more efficient way. Detroit decided to make these tweaks coming off of a World Series defeat. You notice they had Joe Coleman, Bill Freehan, Mickey Stanley, and the protection of Dave LeManchek. And they just kind of finagled the years to optimize the years that these players are in. So that's the tweaking that Detroit did to see if they can get back to the World Series. I'm not sure this Detroit roster is as good as it was because we're getting dangerously close. We're getting out of the 68 Tiger era, and now we're getting close to 73, 4, 5, 6, the Ed Brinkman years and things like that. And yeah, so Detroit, they're going to be kind of a long shot to get back to the World Series. Pittsburgh's been passing. They passed there. All right, now we're going to restart again. Down to 3 tokens. We have a bunch of passes on the board now. Teams 1 through 4, all pass. We haven't heard from Las Vegas yet. Las Vegas drafted John Montague out of 74, but they looked closely and found Max Leone has an ERA a run better than Montague. So they took him as a closer, 24 years old, out of the Atlanta system. 2.64 ERA, a 1.09 whip. So they had to make that move, Las Vegas. Boston's been passing. And finally, that team that created this mad token round, the Dodgers. Remember we talked about them. They spent their money in the draft, so they only have 3 tokens, and they improved 3 of their guys, Bill Buckner, Steve Yeager, and Ron Say. They're just trying to get 9 starters and screw the rest of the team, is basically what the Dodgers are doing. You know, they are really going top heavy and bottom heavy. So they're going to have to add 3 players now. After all these guys I've been showing you, they have to add 3 players. So, the first of which is a shortstop. So Bill Russell is a 4 at short, and they basically said, find a 3. Don't care. Just give me a 3 shortstop. And they found the lowest E rating with that to be Mick Kelleher. He's a 3E16 shortstop who hits 159. So he's actually startable against left-handed pitching. He's got nothing on his card versus right-handed pitching. But he can be shortstop versus lefties, and Bill Russell can go to the outfield, where he's still a 1, by the way, and a platoon in the outfield with all the lefties they have, Buckner or Willie Davis or Willie Crawford. So that's how Kelleher and Russell can work hand in hand. The Reds pass. Seattle needs to add another guy. Jerry Morales, a nice pick here. So Morales was between playing with the Padres and the Cubs. Jerry Morales, always a good defensive outfielder with a decent bat. Not a phenomenal bat, but just a very solid 265, 275 hitter. Not a whole lot of power, but he could hit some homers. In this year, he's got 420 plate appearances. He's got 9 homers, 281, 325, 420, 745. Not bad. His defense is 3. Eventually, he'll be a 2. 72 was, I think, his first year. wasn't particularly good. But the Seattle Mariners pluck him away from the Padres and the Cubs. I think the Padres and the Cubs will probably be okay uh, with other options for Jerry Morales. All right, now more passes between teams 10, 11, 12, and 13, Colorado through the Mets. Brewers, they decided they needed a corner outfielder versus lefties. They had too many left-handed bats in the outfield, John Briggs and Ben Ogilvy, and they decided to release Ben Ogilvy. They realized it's way too early for that. Ogilvy goes to the Brewers, but it's not till the late 70s, and they were trying to see if they could ride Ogilvy all the way through the decade, and he's got some lean years there, so they're not going to do it. John Jeter brings some defense and a bat versus left-handed pitching to the Brewers. Steve Hovley is the Brewer center fielder. They can move him in the left field. Get yourself a 2 with a -2 arm in center field. Help that Brewer pitching staff out. All right, we got some passes between the Padres Astros. The Twins needed to add a shortstop to platoon with Chico Cardenas. The Twins were in the same market that the Dodgers were in when the Dodgers found Mick Kelleher. Mick Kelleher had to be picked in 72. Better year for the Twins, 73. So they found their shortstop as a 336, Craig Robinson. Craig Robinson actually hits 226, but the split's advantageous versus righties. So the shortstop versus lefties is Chico Cardenas, hitting 300. Craig Robinson hits about 260 versus righties, about 190 versus lefties. But that's the perfect platoon. That's how you optimize that position. Plus, he's a 3 at short. Chico Cardenas is a 4. All right, now we're going to start finally seeing more passes. Cleveland, St. Louis, Portland, and the Cubs. The Yankees decided to improve Fred Kendall, a guy they got they got away from the Padres a year ago as a young 1972 player. But Kendall, this is thievery right here. He's got a full season. He's got 551 plate appearances and arguably his best year. 282 average for Fred Kendall. Plus one arm catcher. This team has Thurman Munson and Fred Kendall. So they have a huge abundance at the catching position. Kendall's going to do a little bit of DHing for the Yankees. As a righty DH, remember Ron Blomberg was traded away. Their left-handed stick they have is Gene Locklear. And frankly, Locklear and Kendall, both former Padres, can platoon a catcher. It could be called revenge, as when the Yankees traded with the Padres for Gene Locklear, that was a 2-token trade that San Diego demanded, not a 1-token trade. So the Yankees got their revenge by holding on to Fred Kendall, keeping him away from the Padres. By the way, the Padre catching situation is not a particularly good one. One of their catchers, I'm going to scroll up here, we got in this round, was Mike Ryan, good defensive catcher versus lefties. And in the draft, I'll go bit. They got a left-handed hitting catcher with a lot of pop. Not very famous guy, Adrian Garrett, for the +1 arm, a 222 bat, but it's a lot of power versus right-handed pitching. So that's what the Padres had to suffer for in not getting their hands on Fred Kendall or Chris Cannizzaro. All right, we're getting deeper into this here now. Toronto passes, the Giants, the White Sox. So Oakland still needs to make moves. They took Steve Ontiveros as a switch-hitting DH type, and they needed a backup catcher for Gene Tennis, and they found Pat Corrales. They couldn't get the usual suspects, Ray Fosse, Dave Duncan, Larry Haney. You know, they either were not very good or other teams protected them. But Pat Corrales said, I'll go to Oakland because I can draw walks. So Corrales, it's a 193 average. The 267 on base is better against lefties. He's got about a 300 on base against lefties. So he'll be platooning with Ontiveros. And basically he's just catching insurance. So he might not even play at all. Maybe Ontiveros is the full-time DH for the Oakland A's. They're still going to need to make one more move. All right, Atlanta. Oh boy. So the shortstop market if you've been watching here, has been really drying up, right? Because we went with Mick Kelleher, Craig Robinson, and so Atlanta in the year of '72 finally said, "Oh boy, find me somebody to play short," because Marty Perez is more of a second baseman, and he's forced to play short as a 4. They found Bobby Floyd, who actually can hit lefties fairly well. So Marty Perez hits righties very well. So they can platoon versus lefties and righties, with Floyd being the defensive placement at the end of games. All right, the Phillies have passed after the Mark Schaefer debacle. Baltimore passes. The Tigers completed that Mickey Stanley, Dave LeManchek maneuver. And the Pirates pass. So now we're down to 2 tokens. We should be done. We really should be done. Let's take an overview now as we get down here. Okay, we got all these passes, and remember the Dodgers, our nemesis. They still need to make multiple moves. They need to add position players. They need to add designated hitters, and they need to add a left-handed bat, because all 3 of their left-handed bats are in the outfield: Buckner, Willie Davis, and Willie Crawford. So they get a DH in the National League now, so they found a DH type. Bob Hansen. Who? I have no idea who Bob Hansen is, but he's a really good DH type. First base .425, no hits on his card versus lefties, 91 plate appearances, was probably a pinch hitter. But here's the line: 295, 319, 432, 750. So he's got plenty of enough pop as a left-handed bat. And the thing is, you're wondering, well, how did the Dodgers fall into a guy, in air quotes, that good? Well, everybody else already has left-handed DHs and stuff like that. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. Try finding, good infielders, catchers, left-handed pitchers, stuff like that. Much harder to find. So Bob Hansen is probably the only pure, just left-handed bat without a position who can't hit left-handed pitching in the token round. A nice chunk of passes. Oakland, this is pretty cool. They needed a second baseman to platoon with Dick Green. He doesn't hit lefties very well. They got an Oakland player, Larry Brown. Used to be a Cleveland player. Larry Brown, for the '72 Dynasty A's, had to play second base because Dick Green got hurt that year. They had a bunch of different guys rotating at second base. Larry Brown's probably the best defensive of those players. 3.22. He's good against left-handed pitching. The 183 average is because the percentages were versus righties. He's not going to play versus righties because Dick Green is healthy enough. So Larry Brown, and Dick Green's playing with a 1973 card. So that's how you, in the 4 years, cover these positions. All right, Atlanta. This is the team that actually had 4 lefties, and they were waiting for a trade partner. No trade partners came up, so they just released Mike McQueen, a left-handed reliever, and they got a righty swingman, Ron Schuler. Schuler has some nice years with the Braves before going to the Phillies. He's got a 3.67 ERA in 144 innings. He goes into the Atlanta bullpen as the long man. Atlanta's got a great bullpen. Well, they got a very good one. They've got Tom House. They have Bob Miller, and they have another lefty, Mike Beard. So that's a nice bullpen for Atlanta. The rest of the teams in that list pass. Now we're down to 1 tokens, and basically the cars have all driven away, and the security's mopping the floor. This draft should have been over a long time ago. We have to keep doing this until everybody gets their guys. And I think it's just the Dodgers at this point. Yep, it's just the Dodgers. The Dodgers will turn the lights out on the draft by finally taking a platoon player with that guy, Hansen, they just took, the lefty, and his platoon buddy will be Jim Beauchamp. Jim Beauchamp at 242, but it's opportunistic versus lefties. So when you take Beauchamp and Hansen, you put them together, have him bat against all righties, him against all lefties, you got a 310 hitter here, and you got a 270 hitter here. So it's efficient. And so this is the pay. This is the payback for the Dodgers. Jim Beauchamp, Bob Hansen, and 159 hitting Mick Kelleher. That's what you get if you decide you want to improve Bill Buckner, Steve Yeager, and Ron Say instead of simply waiting for their cards to be improved. You wait for the time. You know, Buckner had a 72 card that was very good, but they moved him into a 73 or 4 card. Steve Yeager had a good 72 card, but they moved him into a 74 card. And Ron Say, he was in a 74 card. They just moved him up 1 year to a 75 card just to get him better. So this is sort of like the first time we've had this many players being improved, but now through the token process, a fair process that rewards teams who spend their tokens wisely and punishes the ones who do not, we have a full 20-man rosters for 32 teams. So with that, finally, here we have the last pass at 159, and of course the zeros. We even did negative numbers if we needed it. That concludes the token round of the draft, which means baseball is on the way. We're going to have opening day videos coming up in the next portion for YouTube here. The opening days of all 32 teams. So thanks for checking this out, and we'll see you then.